Product Direction at Techno Solutions Corporation based in Vancouver, Washington, USA. For today, he's all ours. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please put our hands together for ASHU POTNIS?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So we're going to talk about design thinking. It's a topic very much in vogue nowadays. People talk about design thinking for products, for application system development. It's a popular buzzword, if you will. But what is it? And we'll explore actually a special way by which you can think of design thinking. Does it take time or? Yeah. Thank you. All right, let's start it again. So to explore design thinking applies to how you make your products and applications. How do you start? How do you go about doing it? We'll first look at the traditional method so that we can draw a contrast between how design thinking based product or application development would be as compared to traditional. So this is a very typical way by which you would start developing a product or application using a traditional method. So you basically gather needs. Basically, that's what the end user wants. You elaborate on them. Basically, you would derive functional requirements, non-functional requirements, requirements that will help you develop it, design it first. Then you design it. And a design, if it's a product, it could even be a phone, a physical product, it could be software, anything of that. You design that, and then you develop and test, right? And the cycle keeps going on. It's a very typical cycle. So when we look at gather needs in the traditional way, what do? Normally, we would document market requirements. Basically, what does the market want? The market wants a phone, for example, that has 3,000 million, 8-hour battery life or 24-hour battery life. That's a market need. And then user or business requirements if you're dealing with internal applications, IT applications, and then use cases, user stories we know also are used for that. So that's the method in the traditional way. Then you elaborate. So elaborate, you break it down into functional requirements, what the product should do, non-functional requirements, within what constraints, the business rules, etc. And then you do user stories and use cases, again, to further flesh down the details. And then you get into the architecture. It could be a product architecture from just the look and feel, or the code, design, the framework, whatever else is required. And that involves user interface and user experience as well, especially in nowadays, user experience and user interfaces are very important. So how does design thinking change that, right? So in design thinking, I'll just read this out first. Developing products and systems by understanding users and their needs and developing insights to satisfy those needs. So how is it different? In the first one, you always go to the user and ask, what do you want, and you're eliciting the requirements from them. That's the holy grail or the fundamental of business analysis. You ask the user what they want, and you document it, and you go from there. Now in design thinking, if you see the bolded part here is understanding users. So there is a aspect of business analysis or requirements capture, gathering, or whatever you want to call it, that relates to understanding the user himself or herself. And that is, we'll see, is how it is different and actually very effective, and that is why this process has become quite popular. So this is what the design thinking process looks like. So if you see here, it is different from the traditional development model that we saw just before this. So first you empathize, and that is basically to understand what a user is, what are their feelings, what are their aspirations with regard to the product or anything of that sort. Then you define. Define also involves actually gathering requirements, but yeah, then you define what the problem is, what the needs are. So we call it define. Then you ideate. So in ideate is basically brainstorming, trying to figure out what is a solution that will best fit. So instead of just doing design, you are actually thinking of all possible ways by which the user issues can be solved. You do prototype, then you build and test, right? This part is pretty much similar to the regular one. So what is the fundamental difference between design thinking and the regular way of thinking? If you see on the slide there, the blue line that divides the rest of it, there is one before that, which is empathize. And that is the main difference where, I mean, there are others too, but in today's topic, that's what I'm going to focus. How can you empathize? To give you an example, or rather, let's talk about, what is most important with requirements. The requirements as a profession, you want to make sure you get the right requirements, you develop the right products so that there are no changes when you deliver it to users, because that is very, very expensive. Hopefully you've done your job right and you got the right requirements, you got it validated from users, and the output satisfies them. That is the most important thing. So the empathize actually plays a role in there. What empathize means is you try to learn about your target audience. You're not simply going and taking requirements from doctor, receptionist, nurse, etc. When you're developing a clinical system, you're actually trying to understand the people themselves. Define is, of course, like to develop insights into user needs. So once a user says, so because one of the problems often seen is, user will tell you what they won't tell you why. And if you don't know the why, you end up developing what they ask for. I want another field over here. But that field was maybe for something they want to capture that probably should not have been there to begin with. So if they don't tell you why, and that's why here it is not simply gather, it is define. So you define what the user needs are based on their insights you gain into it. Then you ideate, which is brainstorm, multiple solutions. It's the regular brainstorming practice to come up with solutions that satisfy or tend to satisfy, and then you actually do develop many of them, usually with quick and dirty prototypes. So what we are trying to do is, not just give one solution, but in prototyping, throwaway prototypes, quick prototypes, which are easy and inexpensive, you would develop and present to the user and say, is this what will work for you? And if it does, you go ahead and then build it. So again, you bring that user feedback at the prototype level. So let's talk about the part which I said is actually different, empathize. So empathize basically means, it comes obviously from the word empathy, and I don't think this is even a real word, but it is very much used in the design thinking world. So it basically means, empathy means being able to feel or understand somebody else's feeling or situation. And empathize means being basically able to do that, and to the act of doing that, you stand in the shoes of the waitress, for example, who has to, so let's say you're building a solution for restaurant. You can build, the requirement can be you have to, post orders. The order will go to kitchen. You can do the print bill. Basic stuff you can always do, split bill. You understand that these are the needs and you can put it in there. But until you empathize, until you see how he or she walks around with a tray in her hand, somebody is, hands are dirty, she's just picked it up, and she has to interact with the terminal, then you understand it needs large icons, it probably needs to be a touch screen, there is no time to enter, the keyboard will get, half food in it. Those kind of insights, that's why it's called insights, you will never get just by stated requirements based on simple needs. You will only understand that when you experience it. And this is done a lot, for example, pilots. You cannot design systems, nowadays everything is run by software, right? Your A320, any plane, and controls. So without being in their shoes, you cannot design these systems. But now that kind of a thinking comes into business applications, mobile applications, products, where understanding the life and how people live and do their job is equally important to building the system that you are. I mean, you'll be more closely aligned with their needs if you understand that. So given that we have focused on empathy is important, and how do you develop that then? I mean, what are the ways you can do so? One is, of course, observation. You can go into their work environment and you can observe them, and understand the constraints that they work in, and how they would use your system, the proposed system or the modified system. So so it's not like our traditional business analysis or requirements process did not consider it. It's not so. There were other methods, right? So for example, for understanding user perspective, what do we use, right? Techniques and methods. The techniques and methods we use are, if you do use case modeling, your technique is actors, identifying all actors. Actors are external entities that interact with your system. So by identifying actors, actor would be, for example, again, patient, nurse, doctor, receptionist, whatever, whoever is interacting with your clinical system is an actor. It represents a class of users. If you're doing agile development, you're looking at role, goal, benefit. So the role, goal, benefit is role as a patient. I want to see my test results so that I can get information about my health or the state of my testing. So again, the role is representing patient. So your abstracted needs of a particular class of user. And even in business process models, when you draw the swim lane, each lane represents a role, loan underwriter, bank manager, whatever it be, and then you identify what their needs are. So that's your traditional method, and it does focus on user point of view, user's perspective, certainly. But how about another approach? And that another approach is persona. With personas, you can actually get closer to users. It's a technique. And that's a technique that is very frequently used by marketers. It has been used forever by the marketing professionals. But it's not so much in vogue in IT or product development as such. So the UI UX people, or those who actually work on UI UX, or user experience or user interface, usually they have an insight into what personas are. That is where they, but that is, I'm here to argue that is also not necessarily enough, because they are coming in after the fact. The UI is usually designed once you've already gathered the needs and things like that, and sometimes even the functionality is already been decided. So first, let's explore what is persona. Has anybody used personas here in any of your work that you've done? Okay, we can explore it today then. So a persona is an instance of your target audience that has been brought to life, and we'll see what we mean by that. But essentially, when you put that a doctor is going to use this system, basically, let's say to write down the prescription and write down the symptoms and their diagnosis into a system, you not only write down that what they need to do, right, in the system, you imagine what a doctor would be like, and you actually create a fictitious character to represent that doctor. That is why the next statement says personas help you visualize your user. You need to visualize them to make your product and application be closer to what their needs are, right? Without that, that's the most important thing of any product manager, any requirements engineer, any business analyst. So what I just pointed out was you have these abstract ways of identifying your users, which is actors, we looked at that, roles or lanes in the traditional method. right? And then you have this specific method where we are getting more into the specifics, where you're bringing an instance of one of those into life, or actually all of those, maybe several times, to understand what your real users are like. Because that is the most important thing. I'll just give you one example. Until iPhone introduced the fingerprint scanner, not many, if I don't even know actually, there were any that were doing it, and certainly nobody was doing it that well. And what insight they must have had is understand their users. It's not just that it is convenient. There are times when you are doing things such as driving, and I don't mean you should use phone while you're driving, but sometimes you have to press it just to take a call, or get Siri going or something like that, and you have to unlock it. So with minimal distraction, how you can do that? That was a big problem. Before that, you had to enter a PIN or swipe, and you can't do that while you're driving. So that insight into understanding that a user will actually be in a certain state when using a system is what bringing persona to life is all about, because then you can relate to their daily lives, their daily way of doing things, and that can help you build better products, applications, and systems. So that's what the specificity is about. So let's explore that a bit more. So normally, when you do a business analysis right now, you would write down who the actors are. Actors being, or roles being, the type of users that are going to use your system. That's what the first thing is, normally is documented. And then we go from there. We take the needs, the requirements, and we go forward. In persona, then you say, okay, this actor role, receptionist, I'm going to have a persona called John Doe, which represents a receptionist, or Mary Doe, and that represents an example of what a receptionist is like, because we need to understand our users. If you want to build better products, you need to understand them. So how do you bring them to life then? So what you do is, for every persona you identify, for example, again, a receptionist, or maybe let's take a waiter, you try to build a picture of this fictitious person. Of course, it should represent the reality. You probably observe them or whatever, but you document all that. You can even conduct surveys. There are companies that might even conduct surveys for you. So you identify them in very close detail. Now, when marketers do that, for example, somebody selling you Maggie, they know you better than you know yourself. They are developing and keeping all these personas. In fact, no modern marketer would do it without that. So they know, for example, when a housewife comes home, she's busy, the kids are tugging on her, and they want to push Maggie, that Maggie be the solution, let's say, for that very harried housewife or working mother. And so they know so well what time she will come home, usually what TV show may be on that time, what radio she may be turning on, and then you target your advertising and your messages accordingly. And that is the level of understanding they have. And you might not even realize, I always watch that after I come home, but through their surveys, through their use of personas, they can actually figure all that out. They will also have things like what is the usual education level, what is their income and whatnot, how many average kids they have, and what are their tastes. I mean, they know better than you would describe it. So the point is, some of this is needed for IT as well as product development as well. We don't need to know how much somebody makes, or what TV shows they watch, obviously not. But there is a different aspect of it, which you need to know how they are spending time in front of a terminal or a device doing what else. So what you work on closely aligns with the way they are working, or rather thinking. So the kind of things you want to know is, of course, age, gender, education, their bio. That affects a lot. I mean, what if somebody is fully educated? They have a different expectation from you in an interface, in a product, whereas as compared to somebody who is educated in a different way. What are their logical needs? Logical needs are, well, I need to make sure that a patient gets a An email, let's say, just take an example, for reminder for appointment. That's a logical need. But there is also emotional needs, which is sometimes the emotional needs have to do with the design itself, the user, the beauty of your interface. Sometimes it has to do with the ergonomics. For example, how you hold a phone in the hand is important. And people don't just design phones like that. They actually try out and see how users will do it. And different people react differently to different types of designs. So visuals, interactions, these are all emotional needs. How you give messages. Do you tell them, oh, this is wrong or whatever? Then a user is demoralized for using your system. Whereas you can have an encouraging kind of a user interface which says, try again and give some help and so forth. So those are emotional needs. But anyway, those also need to be understood. So some way of meeting those emotional needs for your target audience. So we need to note down what their state is, what context they are in. They're carrying a tray of dirty dishes and entering the next user's order, what they are going through. You don't want an interface there to frustrate them even further, because that is going to go and reflect on the next customer they're going to serve. What are their goals and motivations? What do they want from your system? Obviously, that is we do that in actors and others as well. And then comfort with technology. I mean, this is just actually a very short list. What we have here, it would really depend a lot on what factors you want to know about your audience, depending on what domain you're targeting, obviously. So, but all the same, you would have factors that will probably be unique to your situation or your user situation. So you should have a template in any case. Anybody has used an alternative method to find out what a user does, their user, in their real life? What they look like, what they do. So this is how a persona is developed. You actually take fictitious pictures. You identify what are the factors you want to know about them. And then you do this a couple of times for each actor or role. So you get, the kind of you build this picture of the typical user of your system. So you can imagine a user and how they would interact, what they would get out of your system. It's not just what they, their stated requirements, but the ability to empathize with them. And that's where I'm coming back to the point that I made in the beginning, that for empathy, personas are a great way to understand. Because this is where you could write things like, the working mother comes home. Well, that's a marketing example. We should not talk about that one. But yeah, we can talk about, I gave example of a restaurant system where how to put orders, how to follow up, how to print. If you understand how frustrated or hurried a user is in that environment, you would think about it before you build a system. So that's another example. So as you can see, there is no really set way. This is not a perfect and exact science. Your personas and the characteristics you want to actually bring them to life is all dependent on what kind of domain you're targeting. And you could easily come up with those yourself. And there's a lot of examples too available. So the persona can have things like technical background. Because I'll tell you example. We are a business analysis tools company, and you may have heard of the name TOPTEAM analyst. So our personas are business analysts, requirements engineers, etc. So when we do this analysis, we see a lot of times that a lot of business analysts are actually users. They were never in an IT situation before they became business analysts. So that's a totally different perspective we did not have before. So how does that affect us? Well, they're not comfortable using complex interfaces or very different paradigm than, let's say, Microsoft Word or Excel, which they've been using, prior to taking on the role of business analysis. So that's an insight you get from some of these. You think about the personas, you meet people, or you observe, and you find out, a business analyst is not always a computer science graduate or whatever. or may have ever worked in IT before. It's common. So those are the insights you get. Here's an example, for example, a complete profile of a person. What do they do? When do they commute? Now this is probably meant for some kind of either product design or maybe for a marketing for a product or service. But for IT also, it's important to know like how people go about doing their things when they use your system or when they plan to use your system. Anybody has any questions so far? Yeah, so a couple of things that also are recorded. Yes, go ahead.
So what I understand from the persona definition, so it is something very similar to shadowing, but here you are creating the profile probably without looking at the user activity in the complete detail. So which technique you feel it's better? Because shadowing gives you the actual visualization and feeling of the user, where the persona is probably you are sitting somewhere in the Bangalore and writing a persona for somebody sitting in the US. So that is one of my question.
Mm-hmm.
And another question is that when you are working on the top-down approach where the management is pushing for some requirement, right? So, and we don't know exactly who are the actual users, right? So how can you define the persona at that point of time?
Yeah, good question. So first one is, I'll just repeat very quickly, is shadowing better? Isn't shadowing the same thing? Shadowing is following your user through the kind of day in the life of the waitress, and you're following around and seeing how she does the work and then figuring out what their needs are. Absolutely. So shadowing is one of the best ways actually to getting empathy with a user. But think about this. You do the shadowing and then you write the requirements. It needs to have a bill splitting capability, credit card processing. It needs to send orders to the kitchen. So you got all that insight and you got the requirements. But what about the rest of the team? How will they understand? So a persona can be built using shadowing. They are not exclusive to each other. In fact, they are very complementary. Shadowing would be one of the best ways of developing a persona, because then you can actually empathize with the user and develop the persona based on that. So the rest of the team knows, right? I mean, ultimately, a requirements document or requirements documentation or gathering is why? Because there's not only one person. If it was always just one person, I don't think it's very much needed even. I mean, of course, I'm going off the extreme here, but yeah, I mean, if there's one person can do everything, you have very little need to be formal about it. And we'll take up the other option later, regarding if it's top-down approach. But just to say, I mean, if it's a top-down approach, we know it's not a efficient way of building systems, because it's not going to satisfy users as well as bottom-up, getting needs from target. Hopefully they will realize someday after a lot of wasted money, So, right. So documenting needs of personas. And I want to just briefly touch on personas there, but how do you actually document their needs? And there are a couple ways that you can do so. One is user story. A lot of companies have started using user stories. It's an agile way of development. Does anybody use user stories for requirements? Okay, quite a few there. And what I will do, the reason I'm pointing out is that these can also be linked to personas to give you that special insight. That's what we will see actually. This is not about user story itself. It's about how user story can actually give you insight into the, or rather I should say personas can help you understand your user stories better even. So a user story is a brief description of user goal that needs to be satisfied by the system. Basically, what are their needs? And how do we structure them? So it's generally written in a text form, and you say role, which is as a goal, what do they want with your system, from your system, and benefit, so that I will have something. So let's take example of the restaurant system. And in the restaurant system, you can have one role as a waitress or waiter. I want to put customer order in the system so that the cook or chef can make it and I can deliver it to the user, to the customer. So that's a user story. And the best part of user stories, it focuses on the benefit. So you can think from the benefit how best to satisfy it, what the rationale behind it, why a user story is needed, and what the user will get from it. The goal is, of course, their need. Benefit is what they're getting out of it. So that's another example. So as a doctor's assistant, I want to schedule patient visits with the doctor so that I can ensure optimal utilization of doctor's time and avoid scheduling conflicts. So actually here in so that, if you see, there is this hidden need. It's not just you want to do schedule. You want to avoid conflicts. You want to use maximum the utilization of time. And that's why this so that part is really good, which is actually also not there in use cases. Because I have dealt with use cases and user stories quite a lot. I mean, that's what we do almost daily. So this part of the user story is really what makes it very useful. And if you use use cases, which also I like equally, no discrimination, but I think there should be an element of the benefit in there as well. So you can always add a field or a place holder in your template to actually document what the benefit user is going to get from a use case. So what is a use case now? Just we'll look at use cases briefly as well. So a use case is, so both are functional requirements, by the way, what the system should do. And you can do non-functional user stories too, but usually the ones that get done first are the functional ones. And use cases are functional requirements too. So in use case, you actually create scenarios to describe how an actor interacts with the system. So it goes a little bit more detail in describing or visualizing how a user is going to interact and get the goal achieved that they have in their system, they want from your system. So a use case tells a story of how an actor, which could be like a receptionist or the waitress, interacts with the system to achieve a goal. It's written, if you use use cases, this is the traditional format. You simply choose the actor, write what they do, then you write how the system responds. It's a dialogue. So you are doing back and forth between the system and the actor, and basically laying out the requirements. That's and then the main success scenario has your where you see the goals being achieved, and the alternates are all the other ones where it's an exception to the happy path. So this is called the happy path, the main success scenario, because the actor is getting his or her goal satisfied. But there are other things that can happen which may break the happy path and make life a bit difficult for them. And that's put in alternate scenarios. Use case diagrams, actually, as you know, use cases are part of UML, Unified Modeling Language. So there's a lot of diagrams that you can represent for a use case. You can certainly do the use case diagram, like you see there. It shows the actor interacting with the use case, and which actor is interacting with this use case. It's very easy to understand diagram there. And there's also activity diagrams you can generate from use case. For example, we have a free tool called Visual Use Case. If you put your use case in there, just the text of it, the scenario, it will automatically generate the activity diagram format, or flow diagram, or swim lane diagram. It's all that is possible because of the structured way that you write the scenarios, main success scenario, alternate flow. So the visualization and diagrams, they are all part of UML, something that is not quite popular in Agile space. So that's how they are different. But otherwise, use cases similar to user stories. So here is the gist of what I'm proposing in my talk today is Just like you can track roles or associate roles with user stories, you can associate actors with use cases. You can also associate personas with user stories or use cases or even features, whatever you use, product features, whatever you use. And by doing so, you can get a very a new or special insight into how users will use your product. And so you can have Mary Doe, and then you can have the user stories that he or she will be driving. And this is not excluding roles or actors or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is an add-on to develop that extra insight that is required in design thinking. And so with this kind of an approach, when you go to a user story, and there are tools which can do that. So if you're looking at a user story or use case, not only can you see what actors, but you can maybe with one click, hopefully, also see the persona associated with it. So because, like answering your question again, one person can shadow, but what about the whole team cannot shadow, right? So if you do this, when the rest of the team is looking at a user story or even a test case, if they can see what's persona that particular function or the personas, because you could have more than one persona using the same function, and certainly this model I'm proposing would allow that. So they can see what kind of people are going to use that functionality, even at the design time, even during testing, even during prototyping. So this helps all along the way in your product or application development. So that was my, I guess, my approach or my argument that in design thinking, if you use personas and with user stories and use cases, you will develop insight so close to what a user wants that your product or application will much more closely satisfy their needs than it would have without that. And that is, of course, what all requirements and business analysis engineers want to do, business analysts want to do. Closely align the output or the solution to what are the basic or needs of their target audience. So now we can do question and answers. Anybody has questions? Yeah.
So my name is Abhishek. I just wanted to understand so while creating a persona, when we are in the process of creating it, is there a metric or is there a benchmark we look at to understand whether our approach is correct or not? So the correctness of a persona, how do we know that can be measured properly?
Yeah, that's a good question, because this is one I also did not, I think, fully address, and maybe there's probably not a good answer to it, but I'll try. So because every domain is different, the kind of persona you have to develop, the characteristics that you need to capture are very much need to be tailored to the area you're looking at. And but there are some that are very common. So there's two aspects: what you capture and whether you're capturing them right. I mean, you can't just imagine a persona. And shadowing, but one of the ways by which actually you can understand the persona. So the two places where you could, go wrong or be inadequate could be, first of all, not understanding what metrics to capture, first of all, and not approaching the right people, because this has to come from actual real world. Even though you're creating a fictitious person, it is actually based on real people. So there are companies that will do surveys for you, by the way. They charge a lot of money because they have to go and do shadowing and all that, but they will build a persona for you. In terms of metrics, I don't think I have a very good answer. There are standard ones: demographics, education level, level of comfort with technology, how much, what tools they have used in the past. What I mean by that is software tools, what kind of devices they use. These are all, of course, standard and you can capture. But there may be other, we talked about like logical needs and emotional needs, those kind of things. They probably would vary from domain and kind of person to person. So not a good answer there. Yeah. Anything else? There are a lot of templates out there, by the way. In fact, it's more difficult to choose which one to use than finding one.
Hello, ASHU, Dilip here.
Hello.
I'm taking this persona and design thinking slightly in a different context, maybe to solve a business problem rather than defining a system.
Yep.
So in that case, many a time the honesty and the openness of the user or the end user comes into the picture. So how do you really handle that aspect when you are really defining and designing for persona?
Can you maybe give a little bit more, elaborate more on what you mean by a business problem? In what context?
Let's say you are trying to make a decision whether to introduce a system to do a insurance inspection or not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many, typically, traditionally, all inspection engineers might be more comfortable with their own schedules, managing inspection their own way. But when you really put the boundaries of the system, they become terrible at managing those systems. Their luxury will be lost, etc. So they might not be open about how they do things, etc.
I understand now. You're talking more of customer adoption. Yeah, and the resistance to adoption because there are ways of doing things and they cannot probably skip certain things now that the system is in place and is reporting it. My only answer to that would be, it's obviously this is a people issue. It's more than a systems issue. But if you look at, if you have the persona modeled, right, there is a part of that which talks about the emotional needs. If there is a way by which you can, that would be documented as an emotional need in your persona, that they are reluctant to enter certain information because they were free to do what they wanted. And so maybe that would, in fact, that's a great insight. You might want to add some flexibility into the system so that it gets more, acceptable by people. So, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
How relevant? In the beginning you have said that this might not be relevant for. This is not usually used in the IT industry or the systems. Hello, can you?
Yeah, go ahead.
So in the beginning you said that this is not adapted by the projects, IT projects as well, but how relevant or how can we use this approach in the IT projects, in the software development projects or some things like that?
Yeah, good question. I'll give you an example. We are a product company, and one of our user roles is a reviewer or collaborator for requirements. We are a requirements product company. So when we saw and we understood, we got this insight, of course, by interacting with our users and understanding, but that interaction led us to obviously develop the persona. So I'll give you this example. This, in a way, it is an IT system. So what we understood was a lot of the times people who review requirements are vice presidents or in fairly high positions. They just don't have time to learn a new tool. And they don't want to look at anything more than Word. Not because they are not technically savvy, but because they have better things to do. So that kind of an insight you can only get by developing a persona. And IT systems are no different, right? Ours is also a software. It's not just a device. So I think the whole gist of my presentation today is actually that it is relevant, And nobody is going to write this down usually. If you don't develop a persona, let's think about it the other way. The requirement for this review or collaboration will never say, oh, the guy is extremely busy or harried and they don't want to do that, right? It would just say a user should be able to look at it, other user should be able to approve it, a user should be able to disapprove it, a user should be able to comment on it. You still don't get this part where how they are going to do it and whether they're going to like it or not, or the adoption part that the previous questioner made the point. That only comes from knowing your users and their daily lives almost.
Yeah, hi Ashu. I was very understanding personas is a very important part even in stakeholder management, which I draw a link to after what you have presented. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and as to how we can use developing personas to effectively identify stakeholders? Because when you identify stakeholders as BAs in specific domain projects, I'm not going to product-based because I have experience in domain-based projects. So the thing is that the users are mostly, and even the business itself are domain users. So they tend to be a little bit of close-minded when you try to find out more about them. They just share selective information, as explained before. So developing those personas and actually identifying the stakeholders of your project, how does personas tie into that? And how do we effectively identify a stakeholder? Because according to the persona, we may think that a stakeholder may play this specific role in my project, but later on you may think that, okay, he is not very effective as this specific role. He or she would be more effective if I identified him as a different role in the project. This goes even in agile projects also.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I was actually going to talk about stakeholders too, because it's kind of like role, actor, and stakeholder, but there is one difference, right? Stakeholders in a project or for a product or application can be actors or users, but they can also be people like product champion, project champion, project. People who are not going to use your system, but they are involved in the development. They have a stake in the outcome of the particular project. So stakeholders are actually a mixed bag. You have actors, representatives in there. You also have other people there which are, so they are related, but in my opinion they are not the same or similar. With regard to your question whether they don't want to get involved or they are not as involved, I'm not sure if personas can help over there. So yeah, I don't think I had a good answer to that, but the stakeholder point is a really good one, because you have roles, actors, personas, and there is stakeholders. And stakeholders are those who are interested in the outcome, have a stake in the outcome of the project or application. But it could merely be the person's funding it is also a stakeholder. He doesn't have any idea, what the system should do. So that's why stakeholders are different. Any other question? All right, thank you so much, everyone, for using personas in design thinking. Hopefully, you would want to use persona in your next project and make it more aligned to the user needs. So thanks so much for attending.